Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Climate Education Goes to School. I'm excited to introduce you to our amazing speakers and see how they can school us on all things climate education, pun intended. um, so let's get started. Our first guest is Bonita Ford, author and speaker, and now Gen Z program lead for Climate Mental Health Network. Congratulations, Bonita, and thank you for
Thank you.
joining. Cone Timmers, executive director of Take Action Global. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Margaret Wang, COO and co-founder of Subject to Climate. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Emily.
And our one and only Bryce Kuhn, Director of Education at earthday.org. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to talk about kind of the topic that we all focus on is climate education. So we're going to kind of take an approach of three pillars. At earthday.org, we have three pillars of climate education, which is frames how we speak about climate education and kind of guiding us today in our conversation. So we're going to focus on the first pillar, which is climate mental well-being. So Bonita, can you tell us why mental health is so important when talking about climate education?
Of course. And thank you very much again for hosting and having us. So for myself, I'm an educator. I do not work predominantly in schools, though I've had the privilege of working increasingly with youth in the last few years. So as was mentioned, I am Climate Mental Health Network's Gen Z program lead. I've also mentored facilitators at Youth Climate Lab, and I ran a local youth climate circle for a couple of years here in my community. And I just wanted to share with you first and foremost why I focus on youth. So there's a story that really sticks with me. When I first started running our youth climate circle here, there was a group of young climate activists, and I was just really trying to understand where they were coming from, what motivated them, and I asked them, "How did you start on this journey?" And two of them, when they were in the same grade, they'd gone to school together, and they said to me that they both remembered it was either in grade 5 or 6, and it was one of the first environmental units that they had in school. And I'm not even sure if they remember if it was on plastics or if it was on pollution, but the content was very heavy for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they went through this class, and then the rest of the class, the rest of the day just unfolded as usual, as if it had just been any other English or math class. And these two young people were just left with a sense of overwhelm. They didn't have the space, the tools, the support to really unpack and process what they were experiencing. And so for me, I that that's something that really has stuck with me over
Mm-hmm.
the years, and just thinking about how I want to support youth in high schools as well as younger students. And so just a few stats that I want to share with you, and some of these. So I apologize, I had prepared some slides, and I can share with folks the sources afterwards. So in a survey of 10,000, it was a survey in 2021, it was of 10,000 people in 10 countries around the world, ages 16 to 25, and in the survey it was found that 59% of respondents were very or extremely worried about climate change, and that 75% believed the future to be frightening. Another study of over 3,000 middle and high school students that were exposed to a wildfire in Canada, they found that 37% met the criteria for probable PTSD, 31% for probable depression, 27% for probable anxiety, and 15% for probable alcohol or substance use. And so when I think about our exposure to climate information, climate related events, climate disasters, we can be thinking on a spectrum between direct and indirect exposure. And so I think so when we think about direct exposure, I can think about those young people who who might have lost their homes in a wildfire, maybe had to evacuate a community in a wildfire. The indirect exposure, the example of the young people in a classroom who maybe have never lived through a climate related event or a climate disaster, but they learn about it in school, and that in and of itself already begins to be a source of distress for them. And then in between, we can think about, so I think a great example last year, the huge wildfires in Ontario, in Quebec, that filled the northeast of the continent with smoke. And so in New York City, in Washington, D.C., adults and children were wearing masks. Some parents, some teachers were choosing to keep their kids indoors. And so even though those kids were not directly exposed to those fires, even if they weren't necessarily talking about those fires in their classrooms or in their homes, there was this kind of in between sort of impact. And so just I think it helps us when we are thinking about climate just to be mindful of the spectrum of potential impacts, and to be compassionate around that we can all come from very different experiences, and those very different experiences can show up in the same classroom. And I think the last thing I'd like to share just in this round of sharing and is just for me when I'm working with groups, I think it's so important to speak honestly, to be teaching honestly and clearly and directly about the the climate challenges, the crisis, the urgency we're facing, because really I don't think there's any real way of addressing this issue if we're not directly talking about it, if we're avoiding it. And at the same time, I think it's so important for us to actively try and cultivate a sense of hope and empowerment, because that is what helps us move forward. And so just if you only take one thing from my sharing today, it's that so more research is showing that people who experience climate distress or climate anxiety, that they are more likely to choose positive environmental behaviors. And equally on the flip side, our us taking collective climate action helps to buffer our climate anxiety. And so our climate emotions, what we may think of as negative mental health impacts, they are actually very natural and healthy impacts or responses to very real collective global challenges. And us taking action is a way for us to help kind of soften the emotional impacts of these challenging realities, and at the same time be taking productive steps towards helping our communities and towards a better future. Thank you. I'll pass the mic
Wonderfully
back.
said.
Thank you.
Wonderfully said. I think something that really stood out is cultivating a sense of like a community. And
Mhm,
when you talk things out, it creates positive behavior changes. And
mhm,
that really goes into the next pillar, which is green muscle memory. And it's a term that, upon reading it, you're not sure what it is. So we have Bryce here who is going to kind of explain what green muscle memory is and how it can be a tool for positive change. Bryce?
All right. Thank you, Emily, and thank you for the other speakers joining us today and everyone watching. So yeah, green muscle memory is the term that we created to talk about behaviors that are environmentally friendly or green that become like muscle memory or instinctual. And so I think about other behaviors that we have in our lives that we don't really think about. So for example, washing your hands or putting on a seatbelt. Originally, someone told us why we should do these things, but now we don't really think about that every time we perform these behaviors. And they're not really a bother to us. It's just something that we do. And in terms of that in the environmental space, I think a lot of us have already developed these habits. So, for example, when I grab my reusable water bottle, at some point, the main motivation for that it was an environmental reason that it was environmentally friendly, but now it's just something that I do. And so, but I think when talking about individual behaviors, it's important to recognize that we're not blaming individuals for the climate crisis. We know that that's something that, even a small number of corporations, but large corporations or governments have a lot of responsibility and could make major change. And many of us live in societies where, behaviors that create more carbon are promoted, or, there's been decisions to actively make it more difficult, like disrupting public transportation. But to think that when we're talking about climate education at a large scale, we're not talking about one teacher, one classroom. We're talking about all teachers in all classrooms. We're talking about over 2 billion people under the age of 18. So if we don't talk about that, it's certainly a missed opportunity. And it also is an opportunity to provide young people with the kind of empowerment that Bonita was talking about that addresses mental wellness. So I love data, and I like when the things I'm talking about can be supported with data. And luckily, Green Muscle Memory can be. Probably my favorite piece of data is that after Greta Thunberg's famous protests in Europe, there was a survey done in Switzerland where they asked residents if they had made behavior changes. And 30% said that after these protests, that they made behavior changes in terms of transportation, the things that they bought, and recycling. So that is one country alone, and that is millions of individuals changing their daily decisions that move us closer to where we need to be. So just imagine if climate education is being taught in all schools around the world, how many people would be changing their behavior. And there are 2 other studies that have been done that specifically tie formal climate education, so in the classroom, climate education, to changes in behavior that lead to decarbonization. And another reason this is so important is thinking about network effects, because we all live in communities. We have our friends, we have our families, we have our professional communities, and these students will go home and they will discuss this with their parents, friends, siblings, and eventually these young people will enter the workforce, and we want people entering the workforce with a green muscle memory, so that if they become architects, they're thinking about how they can develop more environmentally sustainable buildings. If they become city planners, they can advocate for more bike lanes. If they become packaging engineers, they can think of ways to use more sustainable materials or less materials in their packaging. So again, we're advocating for universal climate education and to develop green muscle memory through knowledge. What we learn influences the way we act. So that is green muscle memory. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Bryce. I think something very powerful there is, individual actions, when we all do them, they create a bigger impact that affect communities and create these powerful changes to better the planet. Kind of looking at the global scale and kind of the collective action and how we can focus on positive changes, we often kind of look at solutions and what we can do to kind of combat the climate change impacts within communities. And I think Take Action Global has done a really great job of this. Koen, how have you used technology as a tool for climate solutions and engaged learners through some of your programs?
Yes, great question. Thank you so much. So first things first, as Bryce mentioned, behavior is a really important thing. And so imagine that we would educate all of the students globally about climate education, so about climate change. And so when we started in 2017 with TAG initiating projects and programs globally, we decided not only to focus on knowledge, which is important because we do need to understand some really complex things like greenhouse effects, etc. We need to focus on skills as well, problem solving and critical thinking and creativity. All of those will lead to solutions as well. And then we really want to focus on change of behavior because education is really crucial in that. And so what we basically needed at that time is technology. And we need to focus on 2 different levels there, on the teachers and the students as well. And for the teachers, we decided to come up with a platform we created. And this is for our first project, the Climate Action Project. And so what we wanted is to create a community of practice, as they call it in research. And that is uniting teachers so that they, through technology, are able to communicate with each other They are not only communicating and sharing best practices with each other, like lesson plans and activities, but they are also sharing concerns with each other, because in some teachers' class, it may not work, this collaborative learning approach. And why is that? And so another teacher is able to help them and give some best practices to them. But the great thing is that if you maintain and handle with this kind of education, and you go beyond just learning about climate change, the students will come up with great solutions. Depending on the age, depending on the subject you're teaching, they will come up with different solutions, basically. And so the technology has been helping the teachers to feature and showcase all of those solutions. And allow me to give you just one example about this. The great thing is that one teacher in Argentina came up with just a very simple and easy recipe to create your own bioplastic with milk and vinegar. It's brilliant because at very early ages, students are able to craft with that and create even like small Lego minifigures and tools and jewelry, etc. But older students, they will be able to think about the concept, and is it equally good as other plastics? You know, is it sustainable as well? But it's really great. This is becoming really, really great if other teachers are able to replicate in their own country, basically with their own students and their own ages of students. And so that's a really great example. And another one is creating a solar lamp, basically, a solar light, which doesn't require a lot of resources, which is quite cheap, and still teachers are able to do it. So that is just one application of how we used technology to share those solutions. We have been using it for the students as well. So I mentioned the Climate Action Project, which is going to start in 1 month. It's freely accessible, and we have 5 million teachers and students at this moment. But I can share about another tool we created to measure the impact of climate education. But I can share about that in a few minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think, technology is such a great tool for creating and amplifying awareness, building a community, and, giving students and teachers a sense of agency with such a, powerful, impactful topic. Kind of using our 3 pillars, kind of how we just delved into them a little bit. It's so important to address all components when teaching climate change and supporting educators. So today we have launched our school guide to climate education, and I'm going to bring on our colleague Dennis, who will explain a little bit about what the guide is for, who the audience is, and just give an overview. So thank you, Dennis.
Hi, Emily. Thank you for bringing me on. And before I get started, if in the chat, if you are a teacher or an educator or somebody based in a school, I just want you to put a little comment in the chat just to see who's here, maybe what you teach, what subject, and where you're from. A little bit about myself. I was very much in your shoes. If you're an educator, I taught 7th grade English for many years. And actually, one thing that inspired me to get into the world of climate education was I was teaching 8th grade English in Los Angeles in 2020. And just as Bonita mentioned earlier, there was wildfires happening. And so I had my lessons planned out for the English curriculum, but all my students could talk about was the wildfires. And so I revamped one of my units so that it would be focused on climate change. Now, this is something that I did totally on my own. It was very hard to transition and make this unit into a climate change unit. I thought it went well. The students were very much interested in this new climate change unit that I had, but it would have been great if I would have had some kind of support, especially with my colleagues and at the school and district level. And I think this school guide to climate education kind of addresses that need. Some quick statistics for you. 86% of teachers support climate education being taught in schools. However, only about 45% of educators have received any formal kind of professional development regarding climate education or sustainability. So there's definitely a gap there that needs to be addressed. And the school guide to climate education was created to kind of fulfill that gap. There are states that are making progress. Actually, just earlier this week, Illinois signed a bill that they are going to embed climate education into their science and history curriculum. However, just as Bryce mentioned, we are advocating for comprehensive interdisciplinary holistic climate education, which is, what we need at this moment. The school guide to climate education takes into account all these three pillars that we're talking about today. So we're talking about climate mental well-being. Just as Bonita mentioned, there are students who suffer from climate anxiety. They need a safe space to talk about their feelings regarding climate change. And they need a trusted adult that they can come to for information that they know is true. Again, green muscle memory, just like Bryce said, we are trying to make sure that students develop these sustainable habits. Again, the blame is not on the individual, but we want it to become kind of just a muscle memory that they do without thinking. And then they take these into, into their personal lives, to their families, and they talk about them. And then finally, just like Cohen mentioned, we want students to come up with solutions. They're the ones that are going to be in the workforce in the coming years, and we want them to have these green skills, technology ready, and so they can face the climate crisis. So the School Guide to Climate Education is being housed on our climate education webpage on earthday.org. We're going to be doing several events throughout the fall and the coming year, introducing it, bringing it out to schools. If you would like to be a part of this curriculum, definitely reach out to us. You could reach out to any of the Earth Day colleagues here, so Emily, Bryce, myself. We'd definitely love to show you how to use the School Guide to Climate Education, how to implement it into your curriculum.
Thank you, Dennis. Can you kind of go over a little bit more about what it's offering or how it kind of bridges a gap between, climate education and the classroom? How do you kind of bridge that gap?
Definitely. So it's divided into 4 different sessions, and each session focuses on a different part of our pillars. So there's a session for climate mental well-being, there's a session for green muscle memory, and then there's a session for climate solutions. And so the School Guide to Climate Education allows educators to bring existing lessons that they already have and their own background knowledge, and then kind of redesign it and make sure that their lesson is a climate education lesson. It also allows for opportunities to collaborate with other educators and create these kind of interdisciplinary lessons, so students can see all the different connections, how climate education connects to history, English class. So it's not just, the burden does not just fall on the science teacher to be teaching the climate education. It's everybody's duty to do it.
I think that's very important. It's very holistic. I think we need to have it integrated in all subjects, and everyone needs to have the supports to be able to teach our learners. So thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Kind of looking at the educator perspective and supporting educators and what that looks like. Margaret, your organization, Subject to Climate, has been on the ground and supporting teachers in a number of states in many different ways. What has made it successful?
Thanks so much, Emily. So as Emily mentioned, Subject to Climate is a nonprofit, and we are a free platform providing educators with resources and teacher developed materials. And the goal is, and I think that's what it's been, why it's been successful, is to help integrate climate change into what you already teach. So my background was I was a high school social studies teacher. And while I wanted to be a part of this movement and something so important, the reality was that I was just too busy as an educator. I had too much on my plate. I had to teach so many other things and teach to be honest, a test. So one of the things we realized was that it's really important that it's not that there's not a lot of resources out there. It's just that there are too many out there. And so educators need an easy way to find that right resource that really fits into their classroom and augments what they were already going to teach. So one way that we found that it was really useful is to have the resources in our database, as well as the teacher-made lessons and activities, to be aligned with national standards. And for certain states that we work with, that would be their state educational standards. So that means that, you're not adding more onto their plate. It's helping augment and teach the standards that they may already have to teach. Another thing is that, what is out there? Is it credible? We know that there's a lot of misinformation out there. So we also make sure that we have a scientist review all the resources so that teachers don't have to think about that as well. And then I see in the chat, somebody even said, yes, lack of time absolutely resonates with my experience. So yes, with the standards alignment, the third part is usability. So making sure that it's really easy for you to just get to that right resource that you need. So later I'll put in the chat our site, but our resource database, you can filter resources through the subject that you teach, the grade level that you teach, and even some of the standards, or you can simply search keywords on it. We've seen some people write things like writing or reading or trying to see a math lesson plan. So the usability is really important. You can even filter by language, the region, and topics, as I mentioned, with keywords. And the last thing I think has been really successful is it's not enough to just have resources out there. This is why it's so great that earthday.org has a guide. I think having more guides for educators on how to leverage these resources can help save educators a lot of time. So we also have pedagogical help articles, teacher guides that show you how you might take all these resources, or maybe there's a topic and we try to curate the resources for you so you're ready. I know we've collaborated with Earth Day, for example, on this, and also TAG. So that's one way to do it as well as PD, professional development. I think that'll help educators a lot. So those are some of the things that we've done.
I love that. I think, all educators can, relate to the lack of time in every component. So I think, making things accessible and, being able to, you said, augment what they're already doing in the classroom, I think is amazing. Your resources are wonderful for educators to access. Are there any things you've noticed about your resources or feedback you've gotten from educators?
Right. So, some of the things we've seen, for example, the most popular lesson plan that was created by another teacher that has been the most viewed is a geometry lesson on calculating sea rise. And I'm actually going to put this in the chat. Wow. And so one of the things is that, and hopefully it'll post in a chat soon. But one of the reasons why I bring that up is because teachers are really looking for ways that they can teach the skills that they already have to teach. So for example, this is, a geometry lesson plan, but the idea is that you're making it way more relevant for students. And so that makes it more engaging for them. And as a teacher, that's what you would want. Another popular teacher guide that from last month was, 10 easy use articles for ESL students. So we know that literacy, for example, is top of mind for educators and, especially after the pandemic. And so it's really interesting to see that these are, topics in math and ELA that are the most popular resource. And it shows that climate education is not just restricted to science classrooms, and it's great that it's being taught in science classrooms, but I think what we're seeing is that, teachers want to teach about climate education. They just need a way to fit it into what they already teach. So that's what we're seeing. And we still see a lot of keywords such as reading and writing, and people asking us for more math resources to put context to math. And the last thing is that, it just has to be easy to envision how they might integrate it into what they already teach. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that we've seen in the resources that are popular.
That's great. I think having a platform where educators can post their resources so other educators, United States, globally, can access to teach their students. I think educators are so innovative, and I think it goes to show that they can integrate it into what they're already doing. Kind of going off on climate solutions and kind of focusing on incorporating technology, because we know climate education can be incorporated in all subjects. Cone, Take Action Global has been very successful with incorporating technology as a tool for climate solutions. How has technology made climate education more collaborative?
Yeah, so I think there's two different approaches to use technology. One is in a synchronous way, and the other one is in an asynchronous way, meaning that one is live and the other one isn't. And so I think a really great example for using technology is to have virtual exchanges, basically. What we notice is that students really love those. It's something they are really keen about having those. Because the interesting part about climate change is that the causes for climate change are merely the same in different countries and continents, but the effects can be very different. So students in Florida can have like hurricanes, and in Australia they have bushfires, and in Belgium we had floods. So very different. And having those intercultural exchanges and directly sharing their findings with each other and what they came up with in those solutions, and inspiring each other, that is really great, I think. And they really love that as well. And then the other one, for an asynchronous way, is that what we noticed is that even people who are really passionate about climate change, and obviously also those who are not really, don't really know the issue, but many people don't know what they can do. So many people are pointing towards government and industry, and they do know some concepts, but what can you do in your lifestyle? How can you change your lifestyle at school, at the office, at home, and by taking very simple, everyday, and positive actions? And so that is why we created this app, Earth Project, that's freely available for iOS and Android as well, which shows you what kind of actions you can take, but also shows the right impact you're creating by taking those actions, by showing the amount of carbon avoided. And a new feature in the app will be that students will be able to acknowledge each other's efforts, basically. So you can see that somebody is working in Peru and is changing some things in their lives, and that can be very inspiring as well. And you may think like, let's do the same for 1 week or even like a few months. So technology can do a lot, I think, and it's really great to see how it can do some things synchronously and asynchronously as well.
I've never really thought about technology in that way, synchronously and asynchronously. There we go. Have you received any like feedback from educators using technology? What is the biggest form of technology educators use? What have you kind of seen?
Yeah, so I think feedback we had is that they want to do more, basically, of climate education. I think the first step is a real huge step out of their comfort zone. But once they're starting to do it with their students, they just want to do it for a longer period of time, basically. We try to make technology accessible as well, and making sure that it's even there for those who are not really having those big ICT skills. But a lot of teachers have been requesting training, basically, and it may not be really focusing on technology. It's part of it, but teachers really, really need professional development. They need to know how to do this, both the content, both, and also the pedagogical part. And that is why we came up with the Climate Action Schools program, a full year, and we're doing it with the whole school as well, making sure that they're able to do that. And certification is a really important part of that. And that is what we try to accomplish through technology as well, making sure that all of the teachers have their personalized certificates, and making sure that they are being trained, which we can do. We have been seeing, we already did it before COVID, but because of COVID, everybody started to realize that we can teach and train online as well, using tools we are using at this very moment for this webinar.
Yeah, I think that's important to know, that I think access to technology is also very important, and can really change how we approach climate education. Thank you. Kind of going back to the mental well-being and supporting staff, kind of with, fostering positivity. Bonita, thinking about supporting school educational staff, what are some skills and strategies that schools can use to support the mental health and well-being of its educators and school staff in general?
Thank you for the question. I think it's about creating a culture of care and mutual support. And so I think it starts with taking responsibility for our own self-care and also trying to engage in fostering positive, mutually supportive, respectful, compassionate relationships with our colleagues. I think, as Dennis mentioned before, just the importance of having that support from our colleagues. And so when I think about the capacities that we would want to develop in a classroom culture, I'm also thinking about how do we walk that talk as educators, just the compassion, the mindfulness, the care, the sensitivity, the honesty we want to bring to our classrooms? Can we also really try and cultivate that within our peer interactions, within our in the staff room as well too? And I think that, so when I think about strategies, I guess I think that the tools and strategies kind of trickle up and trickle down, and maybe in a way it's almost more difficult for them to trickle up to a management level or a board level. That I've seen some teachers in classrooms just do some beautiful work and really introducing social emotional learning tools in their own classrooms, and without necessarily having the support of their principals or without other teachers using those kinds of tools in their classrooms. And so for me, I think it's about really trying to bring that kind of having the the language. And so one of the things I have a number of resources that I would like to share, and I'll put them in the chat, and then ask one of the Earth Day hosts to please put that in the public chat. And so a few of the things that I have found that have been really useful. So actually a very simple tool is the climate emotions wheel. And this I've used it with adults, I've used it with teens, and I've seen educators do this with middle grade and younger early elementary students. And I think it's just really about giving students and teachers the language to identify their climate emotions. And it's also about, so it's having the language, but it's also having a practice of learning to identify what is it that I'm feeling as we're teaching this, as we're learning about this, what is stirring in me? How do I give words for that? And then also, how can we co-create a safe culture for that? And so again, that's kind of that whole trickle up, trickle down sort of a thing, that in the classroom we might be, or and whether this is between teachers and students, or whether this is just in adult support groups, having guidelines, having agreements around just how do we create a safe and respectful space, and really wanting to have us be mindful of our own, of what we are, of how we're being impacted emotionally by these issues, by teaching these issues, by learning about these issues. And then with that self-awareness, learning, practicing strategies to help us work through the intensity of those very healthy, very natural emotions, and just bringing it back to those two studies that I had mentioned earlier in some of the opening remarks, just that our climate distress leads, for most people, it leads to positive environmental behaviors, and that our climate action helps to buffer our climate anxiety and our climate distress. So this is a kind of a very healthy, dynamic, self-regulating sort of intelligent system, if you will, and just really trying to find ways to encourage that to unfold and develop in a healthy way for ourselves as educators, the people that are holding space for this process for students, and also for the students themselves as they're engaging in this learning process.
I love it. You mentioned the resource of the climate mental health wheel with the faces and naming the emotions. if I was still in the classroom, I would be using it,
Mhm.
especially for younger students, kind of working through those social emotional learning skills and
Yes.
strategies with younger students. But also, I think adults also need a refresh on that as well. And I think you're never too young, never too old to kind of work through those skills and strategies to navigate the world we're living in. I think that's really
Absolutely.
important. We need to
Absolutely.
have those mastery of those skills. So thank you.
Of course.
One more question for you.
Mhm.
What are you noticing about the connection between climate mental health and teaching about climate change? Is there any big noticings that you have?
So I just want to bring this back. It's a thread that was named by both Dennis and Margaret, and just this piece around the holistic nature of this issue and the holistic ways that we can bring this to our classrooms and to our lives and to our communities. And so I'm thinking about what you shared, Dennis, about the the lesson that you had planned, and then the wildfires that were happening, and just how the students were, that's all they wanted to talk about. And so this, I, in collaboration with Climate Mental Health Network, and this is, so in one of the links that was dropped in the chat, this is one of the resources that folks can download. So I wrote a high school, it's a lesson plan aimed at high school English teachers, but it can be adapted to social studies classes, to science classes. And this came as it was the result of a writing exercise that I did with my youth climate circle folks. And we took an afternoon, we did some writing, and when they gave me their writing, I noticed how varied their writing pieces were. Someone had given me a poem, someone had, what they gave me looked like a journal entry. Another one, it looked like it was kind of almost like a message, a letter to adults in the older generation. And another piece was written more like an article. And what I realized was that there are so many different ways that any of us, young people, adults, that we can be expressing our climate concerns, our environmental concerns, our emotions around all of this. And so I developed this lesson plan around these writing pieces. And there are, so I really, really want to encourage folks to check out all of the links that are in the chat. There are so many amazing resources that Climate Mental Health Network has developed. They're all available for free downloading. And so there's this lesson plan that features the writing pieces of these 5 or 6 young climate activists. And again, they're just kind of bringing it back to the holistic nature of it, that this is not just about something that we learn in a biology classroom, or that we learn in social studies and we put it down there, that this is actually that it can be. And I would encourage us to be really thinking in that holistic, interdisciplinary way of how do we bring these threads into other areas? And equally, as we are bringing these threads into other areas, are we, can we be better supporting the integration of this learning and the healthy emotional, mental development of our students as they're learning some of these very challenging lessons. And so I guess I just want to wrap this piece just by saying that of the resources that I'm recommending on the K-12 education page, there is also an excellent resource that was developed in collaboration with CLEAN, so Climate Literacy and an Energy Awareness Network. And it's a collection of activities, lesson plans that all connect back to social emotional learning strategies and that are for various age groups. So I really recommend folks look at that. And then we have self-care worksheets, taking action worksheets. We have guided meditations. We've got an arts therapy toolkit. So there are so many free resources available. They've all been curated by Climate Mental Health Network's team. And just want to bring it back to reminding teachers that this is for you and this is for your class as well too. And so it's about your own self-care and just really helping to, really fill your own cup as you're going in and teaching about these challenging things, coming in with just in a grounded way to be able to support your students as they're engaging with these challenging topics, and also giving them the tools and the space to be unpacking this in a healthier and a more productive way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bonita. Amazing. I think the work being done here truly is integrative and collaborative, and climate education is for everyone, and can be supported in so many different ways. And there's so many wonderful resources. I think that was the biggest takeaway of today. There's amazing work being done in so many different ways to access materials. So I want to thank the speakers for joining us today and sharing their wonderful resources. All of the speakers' resources are in the chat. Feel free to go check out the chat with all the links. There's lots of good information there. Wonderful projects coming up. And also you can go visit our climate education page at earthday.org. We have our Earth Day Educator Representatives, which is about bringing together educators from around the world for Earth Day 2025. So there's plenty of resources on that. So go check it out as well. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you had some great takeaways that you can also implement into your classroom. So I appreciate everyone for being here. Thank you.